Hello, ladies and gentlemen, it's Mike here at Gamefromscratch, and we've got a funeral of sorts today. What you see in front of you, this is Visual Studio. Now, the student among you might be going, that's not Visual Studio, and you are right. This is Visual Studio for the Mac, and it's been an interesting project. You probably have actually known of it from its past life. Originally, it was called MonoDevelop, and then it was rebranded to Xamarin Studios, or I guess forked to Xamarin Studios. Xamarin are the people behind Mono. Microsoft bought the Mono project and the Xamarin team, and quite frankly, they've been completing this IDE. They rebranded it as Visual Studio for Mac. It didn't make any sense then. It doesn't make any sense now because this is not Visual Studio, but this is Visual Studio for Mac. And the important thing about it is, well, frankly, it is being retired on August the 31st, 2024. So you got a bit of time. You got a little bit over 1 year, or a little bit under 1 year before it goes away. But there is a transition path away from Visual Studio for Mac. Now, there's not a lot of point about talking about it because, quite frankly, it's dead. It actually wasn't a terrible way to work with it, and probably the biggest way you know about Visual Studio for Mac is if you're a Unity developer using Mac OS. Now, it's actually available on Windows and I believe Linux as well. The whole Xamarin Studio thing was anyways. But again, they rebranded it as Visual Studio for Mac. But yeah, it's been retired. So what are the alternatives now and what is going on here? Well, first off, a little bit about the retirement itself. They're announcing the retirement of Visual Studio for Mac IDE. Visual Studio Mac 17.6 will continue to be supported for 12 months until August the 31st, with servicing updates for security issues and updated platforms from Apple. They decided to retire it. We remain committed to development on the Mac with alternatives like the recently announced C# Dev Kit for Visual Studio Code. We'll get back to that in just a moment. What does it mean for existing users? Redirecting resources focusing on Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. No, you're not going to get Visual Studio for the Mac anytime soon, which is weird because the original kernel of Visual Studio was actually cross-platform. So I don't know why they've never made it cross-platform again, but hey, they haven't. They will continue to provide runtime and workload updates, so you can continue to build and ship applications built on .NET 6 and .NET 7 and the Mono framework. Not officially supported, also enabling rudimentary support for .NET 8 for Visual Studio for Mac for building and debugging applications. We hope these commitments and investments in alternatives below, we can minimize the disruption to your workflow on the Mac. So it'll cease to be supported on August the 31st, and then we get into what your options are. Now, the interesting thing about the options are, the first one here is the C# Dev Kit for Visual Studio Code. So essentially what they're doing is turning Visual Studio Code into a lightweight Visual Studio. Now, this is really confusing as well. Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code are two very separate products. Visual Studio Code is more like a lightweight modular editor. It's been embraced by the community. There are a ton of plugins for it. It is cross-platform for Linux, Mac, and Windows. And the C# Dev Kit is going to make C# a better experience. First off, it's going to be powered by a new fully open-sourced language server protocol host, creating a performant, extensible, and flexible tooling environment that easily integrates new experiences into C# for Visual Studio Code. It's not been migrated yet, available later on this week, which I guess should be available by now because this is slightly old news. So what exactly is the C# Dev Kit? It's a C# extension which provides base language service support and continues to be maintained independent of this effort. The C# Dev Kit extension, which builds from the foundation of Visual Studio to provide solution management and templates and test/discovery and debugging. So that one is probably the big one. And then IntelliCode, which is optional AI-powered IntelliSense code suggestions. But the big thing you're probably interested in is this part here. So it gives you the ability to manage your project with a new solution view. So basically, if you're used to the traditional Visual Studio or Visual Studio for Mac solution view, that's not really present in Visual Studio Code. It's more of a folder-based project system. So if you're interested in a solution with multiple project solution, they actually have that in place now as part of this. They also have testing in place for XUnit, NUnit, MS Test, and BUnit. And then improved performance reliability, write your code faster with AI-powered C# using IntelliCode if you wish, develop C# apps from anywhere. Visual Studio Code lets you work on C# projects with Linux, Mac OS, and Windows, or in a dev container. There's also some hosted versions of Visual Studio Code if you want to run it in a browser. So yeah, that is the C# Dev Kit. The big thing here is they brought unit testing and like a solution view, like this kind of We've never really seen this before. You've got a traditional project solution set up inside of Visual Studio for C# developers. And honestly, that is one of those things you really miss when you're working with Visual Studio Code if you're used to like Visual Studio, or I guess in this case, Visual Studio for Mac. Now, again, the reason why a lot of people were using Visual Studio for Mac is because of Unity, and Unity just got extended support for Visual Studio Code as well. Let's zoom this in a little bit. So it provides C# developers with a lightweight, streamlined Unity development experience on Visual Studio Code. It builds on top of the rich C# provided by the CSharp Dev Kit and the CSharp extensions. So you get a Unity debugger to debug your Unity editor and your Unity players, Unity-specific C# analyzers and refactoring, and code coloration for Unity file formats, including ASM, DEF, shader, USS, and UXML. So this package should make it so that basically Visual Studio is Visual Studio Code. God, that naming is so confusing. Visual Studio Code is a better migration path for Unity developers. And the nice thing is this entire suite is free. And again, it is entirely cross-platform. But Visual Studio for Mac, again, the majority of people probably using this guy at this point are Unity developers. That's why that last part is relevant. Well, you guys got about a year to get your butt off of Visual Studio for Mac. But the thing is, when MonoDevelop / Xamarin Studio / eventually Visual Studio for Mac kind of were introduced, there was no real options for C# developers. And then since then, again, we've got the rise of Visual Studio Code, but we've also got Project Rider and other options out there. So the time of Visual Studio Mac is probably in the past, or more specifically, it's August 31st, 2024. So yeah, shutting down Visual Studio Mac, what do you think? Let me know, comments down below, and I'll talk to you all later. Goodbye.